Everyone. So today we're going to be talking about chapter 5, which basically covers cognitive development in infancy and toddlerhood. So as you can probably see, we have lots of infants. As you can probably hear, we have lots and lots of infants and toddlerhoods in our surroundings, and I am hopeful that they're going to help us in our journey of trying to understand chapter 5, right? So, one of the first things we look at when we talk about cognitive development in this stage, which is infancy and toddlerhood, which spans basically from when a child is born till they're around 2 years of age, right? One of the first things that we're going to look at is the cognitive developmental theory, which was put forth by Piaget. And we talked about this very briefly earlier when we were looking at chapter 1 and we were looking at all of these different theories. So, when we talk about the cognitive developmental theory put forth by Piaget, then this stage, basically, when we talk about infancy and toddlerhood, Piaget basically broke down cognitive development, right, into distinct stages, right? So he believed that each stage was qualitatively different from the other, right? So the stage at which children are when they are between 0 to 2 years of age, right, is what Piaget called the sensory motor stage. Now, what exactly is the sensory motor stage? And what does Piaget mean when he terms it the sensory motor stage? What Piaget basically means is that children who are this young have not yet learned abstract thought, or they have not internalized a lot of the world around them. So basically, what Piaget means is that infants at this stage, they think with their hands, their senses, and perhaps, their motor movements, right? What he means is that they are operating on the world, right? And they're thinking as they operate on the world, right? And they're building what Piaget terms are called schemes. Now let's come to talking about what exactly schemes are. So when we hear the word schemes, what exactly comes to your mind? You perhaps might have heard about schemas before, but schemes are basically these ways of making sense of experience. So they're these psychological structures, right, that help make sense of experience. Now, what exactly does this mean? So, for example, there's a toddler in our house, right? Um, he is my brother-in-law's son. So one of his favorite activities, and perhaps I should capture him doing this, is, and he's 1 years of age, right? Is picking up. So his room is on the first floor, right? So one of his favorite activities is that he picks up different objects, right? And he drops them from the stairs of the first floors, and he watches very keenly as they drop to the ground, right? Now, what is happening here? Now, according to Piaget, what's happening is that this child is building a scheme of falling, right? Basically, the scheme tells him that when you release objects from your hand, they're going to fall, right? Another thing that he does is that, he releases objects. Um, he picks up different objects. So some of them are heavier, some of them are made out of metal, some of them are made out of plastic, and he pays very keen attention to what exactly the sounds are whenever he drops in a particular object, right? So perhaps he's building different schemes for how objects sound, right? when they hit the floor, right? So basically, sounds upon hitting the floor, right? So basically, what schemes are then is that they are psychological structures that help us make sense of experience, right? So once this child has developed this scheme that, objects fall, then they will know that whatever object they release, so if they, for example, pick up a particular ball, right, and they release it, right, so they'll know that this ball is going to fall to the ground, right, because they have created a scheme of falling. All right. Schemes are basically created in two different kinds of ways. Let us look at those. So, schemes are basically formed through a process that Piaget termed adaptation. Basically, that an infant is interacting directly with the environment, right, to form some kind of scheme. So, in the example we did earlier, this child is dropping objects off the first floor of his house, and in this way, he's interacting directly with his environment, right? There are two different kinds of complementary activities that are associated with the process of adaptation. One of these is what we call assimilation. So basically, what assimilation involves is that you already have a scheme, right? So for example, considering the same example and taking that forth, we have the example of this child. Let's give him a name. His real name is Rehan. So Rehan, what he does is he drops objects from the first floor of his house. He drops, let's suppose, a ball, right? And it falls to the ground, right? It drops off to the ground floor. And he, through this process, through this direct interaction with the environment, he creates this scheme of falling, right? Now, next time when he drops another object, let's suppose he drops his sister's water bottle. Okay, how do you draw a water bottle? I don't know, something like this. Please excuse my drawing, right? Let's suppose he drops this, right? And this also falls to the ground, right? So he's going to interpret this using the scheme that he's already built, right? Which is the scheme of falling, right? So the behavior of this bottle as it falls to the ground can be interpreted using the same scheme, which is the scheme of falling. So this is basically assimilation is when you are using already existing schemes to make sense of your experience. Right? So this is the process of assimilation. And it's important to remember here that schemes are basically psychological structures that help us make sense of our experience, right? So in assimilation, what you're doing is that the schemes that you've already created, you're just using those to make sense of your experience. Now there's another process that happens, right? Which is called accommodation. Now, what exactly is accommodation? Now, let's suppose Rehan comes across a feather. Now, let's try drawing a feather. So we can erase the water bottle from here. So what Rehan does is, this is Rehan here, right? And he comes across this feather. Well, let's suppose even a leaf, right? Right? And he drops that to the ground, right? Now, instead of falling with the same kind of speed what he notices is that the leaf is falling, but it's almost floating, right? It's falling very slowly. It's almost floating because obviously, leaves and feathers don't fall with the same kind of speed that a ball does or, a water bottle does, right? Now, Rehan needs to make some change because this doesn't, this floating behavior isn't explained by his present scheme of falling, right? So he needs to make some change to a scheme here. He perhaps needs to create another scheme, which is, that certain objects float if you release them from your grip, right? So basically, when your present schemes, right? When your present schemes no longer match or you can no longer use them to make sense of your experience, right? When there is this sort of incongruence here that your experience is no longer explained by your present schemes, they're no longer working, right? So then you have this process of accommodation, right? The process of accommodation can be that you form new schemes altogether or that you modify your previous schemes. And usually what you see is that during a period in which there is little cognitive change happening, there is perhaps more assimilation going on, right? Um, where in ages where there is rapid cognitive development, you might have more of accommodation happening, right? But adaptation is usually a mixture of both of these. So usually, when there is equilibrium, what Piaget called equilibrium, in the sense that when your experience is explained by your current schemes, right? So then you have more of the process of assimilation happening. When, however, you have something that Piaget called disequilibrium, right? Which is basically that your present schemes no longer help you make sense of your experience, no longer help you make sense of your experience, yes. So then that is where you need accommodation, in which you need either new schemes or you need to make modifications to the older ones, right? So now we come to talking about the different sub-stages, because we've talked about how Piaget outlined these different stages according to different years. So the stage from 0 to 2 years is what he termed the sensory motor stage. But what you usually see is that, in the first 2 years of life, there is extremely rapid growth. When a child is born, you have very limited cognitive capacities of, even that is disputed, but let's, start from that there are capacities, but they may be more limited. But then by 2 years, a child is even beginning to talk. So that is very, very rapid growth, right? Um, but so because of that, Piaget, he developed these sub stages to help explain the sensory motor stage better. So let's look at what these sub stages are. Basically, so here there's a very useful table in that we see that this is basically a summary of Piaget's sensory motor stage, right? And then these are these 6 substages, right? So here we have 6 substages. From birth to 1 month, we have only what we call reflexive schemes, right? Now, what exactly are reflexive schemes? They're just newborn reflexes. This is something we've already gone over in chapter 3, but just to refresh your memory, because we've come back from a long break, something like, blinking, right? If an object is moved very close to the eyes, what else was there? So there was something like, stepping. So if you put a child, what you do with a child is that you have their feet touch a hard surface, they're going to start stepping, right? Then there's something like sucking, right? Rooting, right? So if you stroke a child's cheek, they turn towards, wherever that stimulation is coming from, right? So all of these different reflexes make up a child's cognitive capacities according to Piaget. Now, this is something that is very important to remember that when you're considering cognitive capacities in the sensorimotor stage, you're doing that according to Piaget. There is research, and we'll talk about that later in the chapter as well, that does not agree with all of this. But yes, for the time being, this is what we stick to. Then, when we move from 1 to 4 months, right, we have something that Piaget called the primary circular reaction. Okay, now we'll get to what circular reaction is, but basically, what's happening in this stage is that there's simple motor habits centered around the infant's own body, and there's limited anticipation of events, right? So these are two very important things. Now, let's get to what a circular reaction is. So Piaget, what he noticed was that children tend to do something, and children of this stage specifically, what they do is that they accidentally, mostly, right, stumble upon an interesting behavior. Now, what do you think this means, that they stumble upon an interesting behavior? So basically, when you have a child who's between 1 to 4 months of age, right? Now let's take an example, right? Sorry, it's not 1 to 4 years, it's 1 to 4 months, right? So you have this child, and let's suppose they just got done with their feeding, right? And after they're done with their feeding, they accidentally smack their lips. Now, what does that mean, smacking lips? So they basically smack their lips, and they make this very interesting sound when they smack their lips, right? So in order to repeat that sound, I think all of you should try smacking your lips, but something like it creates something like the noise of something like this. I'm sorry about that. But yes, so let's suppose, a child smacks their lips and they produce this sound. Now, this sound, seems very interesting to them in the sense that, they're intrigued by this new sort of sound that they've made, right? This is something new to them, and they have stumbled across this. They have discovered it by chance, right? Now, what a child usually does is, and why this is called a circular reaction, is that a child usually tries repeating this, right? So repetition occurs, that a child tries to do it again and again, right? And that is why it's called a circular reaction. And it becomes, so basically, according to Piaget, what is happening is that this repetition, right, is causing this new kind of scheme to come up, right? And this scheme, you're trying to create this scheme that, once you smack your lips, this is the sort of sound that comes, right? So this repetition leads to a particular scheme being created, right? And therefore, the primary circular reaction is extremely important to, later cognitive development as well. It's kind of laying down the very foundation of all kinds of cognitive development, right? So this is basically what, the primary circular reaction is. One important thing to remember is that what happens is that this repetition also leads to, these reactions becoming motor habits, right? But these are mostly centered around the infant's own body, right? So these are two very important things to remember about the second sensory motor substage, right? Now we come to the third sensory motor substage, which is the secondary circular reactions, and this is around 4 to 8, and this is around 4 to 8 months of age, right? An important thing to remember is what is happening, and this is something you should always keep in mind whenever you're studying cognitive development or physical development or emotional development. You should also look at what is happening in terms of other spheres of development because they're always linked to one another. So in 4 to 8 months of, at this stage, usually infants, right, they are beginning to interact more with the environment. Why? Interaction is increasing with the environment, right? So the interaction with the environment is increasing. And the reason for that is that at this stage, most children are learning to sit up by themselves, right? And that gives them so much more opportunity to interact with the environment, right? With themselves, right? So that is something that's very, very important, that they're beginning to sit up, and that is why there are actions aimed at repeating interesting effects in the surrounding world, because now they're able to sort of interact with the surrounding world in a very new way, right? And there is also imitation of familiar behaviors, right? So there might be imitation of, there's imitation very young of facial expressions, but here you're beginning to get imitation of familiar behaviors as well. For example, if you have certain, toys hanging over a child's cot, have you ever seen that? You have a child's cot and then you have this kind of um, thing hanging from the top, and you have these different toys hanging here. It might be rattles, you might have a teddy, right? You might have a particular odd looking rattle here, right? So a child might learn that if they sort of hit at, these objects, right? So these objects or this whole thing, it moves, right? And they begin to repeat this action, right? So they tend to repeat familiar behaviors. They're not yet, at that stage where they're repeating unfamiliar behaviors yet. That is something you get more of as you move, as they get older. At the fourth substage, right, you have something which you called coordination of secondary circular reactions. And this is around 8 to 12 months, which is, physically what's happening here is that children are beginning to crawl. Most children also start to walk at 12 months, right? And another thing that you hear is that, children start to practice what is intentional behavior, right? So what you can see is that their behavior is not random, it is not just imitative, that they have a particular goal in mind. So for example, if they're crawling towards an object, they have a goal in mind that they want to hold that particular object, or they want to, inspect it, right? Then you also have some, sort of evidence of object permanence. What exactly is object permanence? It is this understanding. So, object permanence is a very, very important milestone that young children reach. So, with very young children who are younger than 8 months, right, you don't have a lot of object permanence according to Piaget. What that means is that if an object is out of sight, right, according to young children, it ceases to exist because they haven't yet learned to represent it mentally, right? Because mental representation is something that's not really present yet. So if, for example, you hold a very, a particular toy in front of them, right? A particular doll, or, this toy, this hideous looking toy, right? Let's suppose you hold this out in front of them, right? And with children who are younger than 8 months, if you hide it, right, so they'll forget all about it. But, if, for example, you have a cushion or a pillow, right, and what you do is that you hide this object behind the pillow, right? So an 8-month-old child, 8 to 12-month-old child will be able to get it from behind the pillow because they understand that the object doesn't just cease to exist if it's not in sight, it does still exist behind the pillow. With a child younger, they might not look for it because they do not have the concept of object permanence, which is the idea that objects continue to exist even when they are not in sight, right? So this is a very, very important milestone that children reach, right? Because it denotes that they have learned to mentally represent objects or hold them in memory, right, for a given amount of time. What exactly does goal-directed behavior mean here, right? So according to Piaget, what goal-directed behavior means is that infants are now able to coordinate their schemes in such a way that they have a greater understanding of the world around them. Now, what does that mean? Now, when we talk about schemes, right, a process that, according to Piaget, happens with schemes is that of organization, right, which is a mental process in the sense that this does not involve direct interaction with the world. Rather, what it involves is how do you integrate schemes within one another, right? So remember when we talked about Rehan in the beginning, right? What we said was that here Rehan is standing on the first floor of his house, dropping different objects, right, from the first floor, right, and creating schemes of, objects falling, right? Now, Rehan has another interesting habit in which what he does is that sometimes he picks up toys and he throws them against walls, right? Now, these two schemes are kind of interrelated. When he forms this scheme of throwing and falling, right? These two schemes are interrelated in some way, in that the scheme of throwing, right, results in the action of falling, right? So here is one scheme, and here is another scheme, right? Now, with the process of organization, right? Now Rehan has built these schemes, the scheme of falling and the scheme of throwing, right? With direct interaction with the world. But how exactly are these two schemes related to one another? How does falling relate to throwing? How do these schemes, so this is one scheme and this is the other scheme, how are they related? Now, this is something that is involved in the process of organization of schemes. And what happens is that as you build these different schemes, you also mentally organize them. And as you organize them, you develop a complex mental world, right? And this is what is happening when we talk about intentional behavior, right? That children are beginning to combine different schemes, right? Um, Together. So, for example, when Rehan finds an interesting object, so let's suppose that he finds a cell phone, right? And he takes that cell phone and he runs towards the stairs, right? Now, what he's done is that he's combined the scheme of throwing, right? So he knows that if he releases that object from above the stairs, this object will fall, right? And he's doing it because he has a particular goal in mind. He wants it to fall, right? So he's basically what he's doing is he's combining these different schemes because he has a particular goal in mind, right? So this is a very simple example of goal-directed behavior. Your book provides another example which has to do with, object permanence, which is basically that if you hide this toy behind this cushion, right? Now a child is able to coordinate two different schemes. So one of them is pushing aside this pillow, right? And recovering or holding the toy, right? And then retrieving the toy. So that again is an example of goal-directed behavior when a child pushes aside, this pillow, right, to find the toy underneath it, right? So in here as well, a child is integrating two different kinds of schemes in order to solve a simple problem that they are sort of confronted with when someone hides their favorite toy, right? So I'm running out of time, but let's move on to the next video in which we take this further.